Hello, I'm Sean Spear, Project Director for the Ontario 360 project here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. As viewers may know, we've been producing a series of policy briefs on issues of interest to policymakers here in the province of Ontario. Over the past several weeks, we've released papers on topics ranging from skills training to provincial municipal fiscal relations to business supports and so on. And this week's no different. I'm here with Jon Medow and Ollie Sheldrick, who've just produced a paper for us on the question of foreign credential recognition and the integration of newcomers into Ontario's economy more broadly. This morning we held one of our policy breakfast sessions where Jon and Ollie shared their analysis and findings with a mix of policymakers, members of the political arm of the government, and a broader range of stakeholders. And I'm pleased to have them here now to talk a bit about the paper, its key analysis, and its recommendations to ensure that Ontario is really taking advantage of the human capital represented by newcomers to our province and our economy. Thanks so much for the paper. The discussion was spirited. I think there's obvious interest, and it comes at an important time. Not just as the province prepares the forthcoming budget, but also a moment of reorganization.
That's right.
In the province. Why don't you just talk, Jon, a bit about the changes that we've observed in ministry and in policy issues, and why the time seems to be ripe for an affirmation of the importance of foreign credential recognition and a mix of policies to improve outcomes for newcomers here in the province.
Sure, absolutely. So, the big focus of this paper is around creating a professionally skilled immigrant success strategy for Ontario. And one of the things that we talk about is how responsibility for the tools that Ontario has at its disposal to address this issue has shifted around a little bit in the last year and a half. So it started with the former Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration, which is closed and was moved to the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities. And in the most recent iteration is with the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development, the newly expanded Labor Ministry. So in that new ministry, we're seeing a real opportunity to consolidate leadership and drive a strategy forward.
That's great. Now, Ollie, in the presentation, you observed that while there's been some real successes with respect to improving outcomes for immigrants in the province, there's still a gap when it comes to a range of economic indicators, including labor force participation, income, and so on. And that gap, as you said, doesn't just represent opportunity costs for those individuals. It represents an opportunity cost for the province, which is going forward going to be relying heavily on immigrants to help fuel our labor market and our economy. Can you just situate the paper in terms of the current state of play with respect to economic outcomes for newcomers and immigrants into the province?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yes, the overall policies of bringing in more immigrants into Ontario and those immigrants being highly skilled, that's been successful. We've had great outcomes there. But where we're seeing the gap or the misstep is in the outcomes they have economically. So, even after 5 years in Canada, for all immigrants, we're seeing that they're still not earning to even the median level for the province, which obviously is not ideal, especially when we consider that many of those are going to be highly skilled. They will have a bachelor's degree or higher. And that issue is particularly relevant when we sort of split this out by gender and we look at women and we look at spouses, and their earnings are just falling so far below this median. And that's a huge missed opportunity in terms of, yes, their experience, but yeah, in terms of bringing in people that are going to grow the economy in Ontario and ultimately, be taxpayers, support the economy and support, the government as well.
One of the observations you make in the paper, which I think may be of interest to viewers, is that presently, and understandably, a lot of the focus when it comes to foreign credential recognition has been on what are described as the regulated occupations. So these are parts of the labor market where licenses are required, or there are professional bodies. Viewers might think of being a lawyer or being a doctor or other professions where licensing is required. And that's where it's those occupations where a lot of the emphasis and focus has been, and we could talk a bit about where there's been some positive developments and where there are still work to be done. But what's striking is that 80% of the labor market is non-regulated. So the issues there aren't about working with a licensing body to recognize foreign credentials. It's more about trying to persuade employers, persuade the market more generally, that they ought to take a chance on an immigrant or a newcomer to the province. Can you just talk a bit about the difference between the regulated occupations and the non-regulated occupations, and how policymakers ought to think about these two issues and where they converge and where they may diverge?
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, one of the things we cover in the paper is that regulated occupations encompass about 20% of the labor market, with unregulated occupations where you don't need a license to do your job is about 80% of the labor market. Our perception is that over time there's been more policy attention to the 20% on the regulated sectors. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. First of all, it's an incredibly important issue. When people are unable to do jobs that they've been trained for and have certifications and qualifications for, it's a big problem. The other aspect of that, though, is it's just a bit of an easier to understand issue and story. The fact that someone is a doctor or a lawyer and just not allowed to be that here, that's a story that is very powerful and has attracted a lot of attention.
It's a self-evident problem.
That's right, it's a self-evident problem. And our view is that focus on that problem really does need to continue. In Ontario, we have the Office of the Fairness Commissioner, where someone has been recently appointed to that role again, and that process needs to continue focusing there. However, we also think that the broader 80% of the labor market is really important, and that it's critical to look at some of the more kind of direct programming that can be built out in the labor market, serving both people looking for a job, but also employers looking for employees. And that shift towards orienting programs both to job seekers' needs, but also employer needs, emphasizing the need to grow focus on employer needs, we think is something that's going to increase the ability to build connections between people that want to work in a variety of different fields, whether that's being a software developer or working in a financial institution, with the employers that need that talent.
Can you just elaborate on that, John and Ollie? This point in the paper about the need to shift some of our pre-existing programming more in the direction of demand-driven. We heard something similar in a paper that we released last year on skills training. The same idea that too much government programming was oriented towards supporting the supply of skills or the supply of labor, and not enough on being oriented to the demands that the market has. So in practice, what might that look like when it comes to the question of foreign credential recognition and the integration of newcomers into the labor market?
Sure. So I think one of the things we discussed this morning is that there are many successful initiatives out there that are really built around employer needs and that are responding to employer demand. And one of the things that we think Ontario really could do is look at those programs that are having success and then track back into the kind of parameters of the programs, what it takes to get funding, and build that in, to build that notion of serving a coalition of employers with shared needs as part of an employment program serving immigrants. So we think that's really where opportunity lies, is looking at those programs that are succeeding and responding to employer need, and then making that part of a program. The goal of the program is not just to prepare someone to participate in the labor market, it's also to help organize demand. It's to help bring employers together that have shared needs and give them solutions that can be found in immigrant talent.
And Ollie, let me just take up that question with you. As the Ontario government thinks about this file, as it thinks about what it's doing well and where there's a need for improvement, can you just elaborate on some of the other key recommendations of the paper? Where else should Ontario policymakers be placing a renewed emphasis in terms of the current mix of policies and programs and services?
I mean, one of the areas that we feel would make a big difference is around the eligibility requirements for some of these funding programs. So it's slightly complicated. There's some programs that are federally funded, some that are provincially, and the eligibility does vary ever so slightly on those. But in broad brushstrokes, we see that people with work permits, for example, are often excluded from accessing a lot of these programs. And we've seen federally a push towards thinking more about people that are in here, Canada, and working as being a much more viable pool for people to be permanent residents and citizens. So with that in mind, we should be thinking about how we can better align those two objectives and ideas, and expanding eligibility, increasing access, and also, one of the points in the data was the big gender gap, and engaging women more by understanding, that often people that are citizens of Canada might still be relatively new to the labour market and have some of the same challenges of immigrants if they've been outside of it due to family care needs or something similar to that.
That's great. And just a final question. I know I've taken up a lot of your time today, but it follows on something you said, Ollie, which is this is an area of shared jurisdiction. And so, Jon, the paper talks a bit about working with employment organizations here in the province to develop a coherent vision that can then be taken to Ottawa and used to inform intergovernmental collaboration and also advocacy with the federal government. Do you mind just elaborating a bit on that?
Yeah, happy to. A thread that winds through the paper is a discussion around how many sophisticated employment organizations we have in Ontario that have really grown in recent years in their capacities and their range of activities. And we're recommending that the new Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development really begin all of its efforts in this area with a discussion with them about what's working and not working, both in terms of provincial programming, but also in terms of priorities for what the federal government can change, can further develop. One of the topics that we talk about in that regard is pre-arrival services. There are some good supports out there, but there's a real opportunity to expand the range of possibilities for people who are about to come to Canada to connect with the labour market even before they arrive. And there are some good practices out there to scale that we think Ontario employment organizations, service providers would have a lot of great things to say.
Well, that's great. Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for the paper, grateful for your analysis and your recommendations. I think they come at an exciting time, as we talked about at the outset. The policy landscape seems to have settled. We have the appointment of a new Fairness Commissioner. We have now a consolidation of these responsibilities within the old Ministry of Labour. And as you talked about in your presentation, there's a degree of intuition about foreign credential recognition being housed in the same ministry that's responsible for regulating the labor market and so on. Yeah. The opportunity now is having settled the policy landscape to begin to action some of the recommendations in your policy brief, and ultimately, as you say, Ollie, to take advantage, to utilize this critical mass of human capital that we have in the province to the betterment of these people, their families, but ultimately the broader province. I think if Ontario policymakers use your policy brief as a roadmap, we'll be better served in that regard. So thank you,
very much
for your contribution, and thank you for viewers for continuing to follow our work here at the Ontario 360 Project. We'll be back in the coming weeks with a new set of policy briefs, all with the ultimate goal of informing and shaping public policy here in the province and supporting public servants, members of the political government, others who are grappling with the big questions facing our province. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation.